Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Ascendle Unscripted. Today, we're diving into one of the most pressing issues in tech and healthcare. What does true organizational readiness look like? And how do you know if you're ready? I'm joined by two folks today. First is Susannah Parnin-Mitchell. She's an Ascendle Unscripted veteran and VP of Operations at Ascendle. We're very pleased to have also Bridget Bell, VP of Business Development at Cardamom Health. I'd like to kick things off with a first word that comes to mind when you hear organizational readiness. I'll start with Bridget. So what's the first word that comes to mind when I say organizational readiness?
Think of receptivity or receptiveness. So what I mean by that is being open to this incoming change, being open to this large initiative that is AI, and being receptive to the reality and open to the authenticity that exists in acknowledging you don't have it all figured out yet. And you don't really know what you don't know. So I think we all decide in our brains that AI means this or this, and it really means something in the middle. So there's a lot of fear and panic on those potential ends of the spectrum, but being open to listening and having that mindset instead of just hearing what's being said, truly digesting that and coming in with an open mind to make things happen.
Susannah, turning it over to you, when I say organizational readiness, what comes to mind for you?
Sure. I think the word that comes to mind for me is multifaceted. I think there are several lanes in which you need to be ready. Not saying that it's incredibly hard to get to, but just different lenses you need to verify through.
Thank you for that. So we got receptivity and multifaceted. So just kind of backing up a second, when we say readiness, to define it for this episode, Bridget, what would you say defines readiness? How do you know? Or what does that look like? What needs to be in place for readiness to be present?
Well, I think you're never going to be at 100% level of readiness just because we work with people and there's always a lot of extra variables. We also, especially if I'm coming at it from the healthcare lens, you're working in a space that every day is a new adventure. Different regulations are coming down, changes are happening, different diseases are progressing in different ways. So you just inherently have to be nimble. So being as ready as possible given the set of circumstances in front of you is what's most important. And I think that goes to what makes a strong leader is making the right decision at this time, given that information, and then making the next right decision as things change. So that readiness is going to be a constant moving needle, but you need to be prepared to take those steps toward that needle as it moves also. So that means organizational alignment. No decision happens in a vacuum. Even if this is seen AI, this is an IT initiative, or this is a data and analytics initiative, nothing is going to happen if you're talking about AI for the organization. If you're talking about it on the clinical side, you have to have physicians at the table. They need to be part of making those decisions, being aligned to the goals, the why behind it, and then making sure that you have that general understanding of what does this actually mean and what will this mean for our work, and being open to that exposure for your team so that they can start to get acclimated to what the change is going to be ahead of that change taking place. So there's process parts of it. There's huge people parts of it, which are the hardest ones to solve for. And there's the technology parts of it. And I would argue that the technology is the last in that line because the people in the process are more difficult to get in line than the tech is.
Bridget, I was going to ask what context surrounds what you were talking about, but it sounds like people, process, and tech could be the trifecta of the things of kind of context determining readiness.
Yes.
Susannah, for you, what does readiness look like?
Well, I was nodding along with Bridget. I think the lens of people process is correct. I think I would edit to add tools and strategy. So maybe a 4-part lens. I think the tools part, as Bridget was saying, that's the easy part. That's the technology side. You know, is your data ready? Is your infrastructure there? Do you have those pieces in place? And I think that I agree. That's a follow-on. I think the strategic side, arguably the most important of this, that's where you would evaluate, do we actually have use cases that need AI, and does the use of AI actually align with our strategic goals as an organization? I think that part's, incredibly important to get to. And, to Bridget's point, the alignment around that is incredibly important to get to. On the process side, I think, that might also be a little bit easier to get to. That's the governance. Do we have the right data governance, AI rules in place for how we're going to use it? But the people side, I'm glad you said this. That's also interesting. Do we have the right talent? Do they have the right skill sets? But do we have the right leadership for this as well? And I think that's an interesting lens, because it's not something you can appoint, I think, when it comes to AI projects. I think that needs to either emerge or be kind of sourced, because it has to be paired with just a genuine interest and curiosity and desire to keep up with all the changing landscape of AI. So I think readiness needs to be all of those things.
So what we laid out here is people, process, tech, tools, and strategy all coming together. So we talked about what good looks like. Susannah, I'd like maybe to just stay on you and say, from your experience, what does not ready look like? This question and to this point of, if I'm a leader and I'm thinking about things or looking at an organization, what might be some indicators of not ready instead of ready?
I think one indicator that I've seen is when the technologists are trying to come up with the use cases to build AI into the project, right? When that's not being driven by a market demand or a true product use case that would benefit the customer or the user, but instead it's a desire to use the tech. And that's not just limited to technologists. I think that there's pressure, right? There's real world pressure that boards are probably facing. Like, how can we use AI? How can we use AI? That is being responded to in this way. Like, you're looking for the technological tie-ins versus the true use cases. So I think when that's happening, it's an indicator that you're not truly ready. You haven't done that strategic alignment first.
Susannah, thank you for that. Bridget, I'd love to ask you, going off of what Susannah was talking about real use cases, can you share an instance where AI integration worked well, where there was a significant improvement around a patient outcome?
Yeah, I mean, it's about picking which one, right? So I think this is a good example because it's something that can work well, but it highlights the importance of doing it right and doing that forethought ahead of it. So for example, no-show rates are a big thing. It costs organizations money when patients no-show for their visits. It also impacts the utilization for these providers. That can impact their compensation depending on how that's set up. And ultimately, you have to take care of the business to take care of the patient is the way that we think about the healthcare. For those of us who come from like a clinical background and it's hard to think about the revenue cycle side, that's where it gets me. So in order to look at AI and how it's meaningful in predicting no-shows for an organization and being able to take the steps to clear up space on a calendar and better fill or double fill for providers, you have to really have well-educated AI tools. What I mean by that is you have to do as much as possible to remove bias that may exist in the system and in the data. So things like social determinants of health, underserved populations. These are characteristics you really need to be able to account for in that data, because oftentimes the highest incidence of no-shows are for populations that are dealing with a lot of things like transportation issues, other crisis interventions, et cetera. So instead of just looking at the raw data and saying, okay, we're going to just remove these folks from the calendar, or we're going to always double book because we know they're not going to show up, taking that as to an extra step using AI and saying, hold please, we're seeing that there are trends here that are being identified. We can use this now to become part of patient outreach as well, so that patient care coordinators can actually be in touch with these patients that are high risk for no-show. We can improve their overall experience with the healthcare system, which is important. We can ensure that they're more likely to be present at their visit, which is better for closing their care gaps, as well as for the organization from a revenue perspective and utilization, and ultimately get to a better end result and looking at it much more holistically than just thinking about those no-shows and not realizing that there might be underlying bias in that data.
Well, it sounds like the curiosity theme continues into looking at data and saying, well, hold on a second, what is it about this data set, or what is it about this cross section that we might need to look a little bit deeper on it? Is that in a way what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yep. Let's not just take things at face value. This is more complicated than that.
I do have one question for you. So in training up the AI, how does one make a distinction? It's learned, this exponential growth. How do you understand or make a distinction between a bias that had been trained into it, as someone would say in our humanity, we've got what do they call unconscious bias or the implicit bias. So do you think that we're at a point right now where some of the AI is going to have implicit bias where it's hard to identify? Or are we still in a place where, we could catch it and start to build it in a way that's going to be most beneficial for the most amount of human beings?
Well, I think that ultimately comes down to what AI platform you're working off of, because some AI platforms inherently learn based upon the data that is input into them, in addition to the training that is actually inherently done by the data scientists. And some do not learn based upon the data that is input into them to maintain more of that cleanliness and that kind of clean slate for different client organizations. So part of that comes down to your ultimate tech underneath. I think it's probably inherent, but I would recommend, kind of making those decisions very consciously before you embark on this, because, inadvertently, sometimes we can put ourselves in a predicament with best intentions.
Bridget, thank you for that. Susannah, from your experience in getting organizations prepared for an AI adaptation, what are some common pitfalls you see? Because there are a lot of organizations that are ramping up, or this might be new. Speaking to those organizations who are starting to move into it, what are some things to look out for?
I think one of the things, back to the use case idea here, one of the things to do it correctly is to identify those use cases to start with that are maybe lower risk, that Bridget was pointing out some things that might be inherently risky, especially when we're talking about healthcare and people's health and decisions that could impact their livelihood. Maybe those aren't the places to start for an organization that's just getting into leveraging AI. Perhaps, it's more about administrative effectiveness or operationalization of something, getting more effective at the repetitive tasks that could reduce error versus introduce error. And maybe it's more of the augmentation to get used to it, to give it time, like you were saying, Michael. So I think that's some advice I would have in that area, is start in a safer area if you're using it, to give the time and space for the evaluation that Bridget was talking about, the thoughtful integration into those more impactful types of uses.
If I could maybe ask you to go a little bit further and share just a bit about how Ascendle specifically approaches that cross-functional alignment that you're talking about to make sure that the technical and the operational comes together.
Right. I think we zoom all the way out. We ask the why first, right? You have to start with the why. Why are we doing this? What problem is this solving? And then you can evaluate how to solve that. And AI might be one of many answers. So I think that's how we approach it. We start with the why. We start with the strategic need and the problem to be solved before applying AI as the remedy to that problem.
Susannah, thank you for that. Bridget, I would love to shift over to you to talk about leadership and what actual behaviors or signals that show a leader is driving change effectively, because we're talking about augmentation, we're not talking about replacement. And of course, this starts with the leadership and oftentimes finds its way down. What are some of those behaviors or signals in your view and experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, to continue with our theme, the theme of curiosity, never thinking that they're the smartest person in the room, realizing that there's value from the diverse thoughts that come about across the team engaged, being open to change. And again, giving that message of, there's a good reason behind this, understanding the why, and not only understanding the why for them, particularly in their role, but for different parts of the organization and the organization holistically, because what that why means between different parts of a business versus the whole business trickles down in a different way. So being able to well translate that to other members of the team and continue that message forward, especially in the difficult times, and to really be kind of that messenger of change instead of like a harbinger of bad things to come. So I think that's very important. It's the how that people remember most. We talk about experiences. I mean, think about it. Anyone that you meet and interact with in life, you're left with that feeling, that experience. That is what a leader needs to bring forward. So it's the multiple C's, the confidence, the credibility, so they do know what they're talking about, being concise. Nobody wants to be talked at for a really long time, so let's get to the point as quickly as possible, and being concrete in what those next steps are that need to happen in order to get us moving toward that change.
Bridget, thank you for that. I'm only smiling because you sound like me talking to my students at UNH Business School about trying to be concise in communication and how they're going to go out into the world, and they're going to run into a lot of folks where the concise still needs some work, even folks that are high up in organizations. So in healthcare specifically, Bridget, where is AI actually working? I think you touched a little bit on this previously, but I would love to hear where it's working well, and then if maybe there is a red flag or somewhere where it's like, not yet, or we need to keep an eye on this.
Yeah, I mean, AI is doing so much in so many spaces. So everything from automations or, predictive analytics, even when it comes to denials and things like that on the revenue cycle and finance side of the world, automating things in the coding space, even chart reviews and things like that people are trying to take AI into, and that can be really meaningful. Other spaces, you think about robotic surgeries. AI is part of that. Yes, it is, again, a meaningful tool to supplement a provider in that space, to supplement a surgeon, not to replace. But that is AI, and that is, better healing outcomes, shorter recoveries, less of an incision, less blood usually required for those surgeries. Those are huge advancements that are very real and are part of the AI puzzle. We also see wonderful things happening in the predictive analytics and AI space, where you're able to better digest huge amounts of data, which is the biggest strength that comes out of AI, huge amounts of data that might take people weeks, months, literally years, take that down into days or weeks, and now actually set people off on that course for change. So that is happening across organizations holistically, from EHR consolidation efforts to cleanup and optimization efforts, standardizations with mergers and acquisitions that are happening in healthcare, getting everybody to, again, that standardized experience across a large multi-state health system is very difficult to do, but AI makes that so much easier and actually manageable from a resource and time and cost constraint perspective that previously just these things couldn't necessarily happen, and even less so with the downward pressures that we have on the market. Other areas would be things like, how are we using AI, which is very meaningful, to predict nursing shortages and predict nursing turnover. So being able to bring in data from disparate sources, like the time and attendance system, the ERP system, your EHR, and then also other demographic data that's stored therein about how far someone lives from their place of work and things like that, and take all of that together to predict where there's going to be turnover, and then decrease the reliance on some of the contract, very expensive resources that hospitals have to bring in, and still ensure they're meeting patient care demands, and look at where the cultural shift needs to happen to do things to better retain the good talent they do have. So I think we're doing better to think about AI in multiple different areas. And that's really exciting because there are so many meaningful implications that don't mean that it is necessarily, not safe in the world of healthcare, because we're still, I think, getting deeper and deeper into the clinical applications of AI. And there are some really meaningful ones, but we still need to proceed with a little bit of caution from a legal perspective, from a safety perspective, from an ethical perspective. So that's where, for me, some of those red flags go up, that I know, just me personally, I don't mind the interaction with an AI chatbot to schedule my appointment. That's great. Easy peasy. I can go forth. I don't necessarily only want to interact with a bot when it comes to understanding my diagnosis, because I'm a complicated human, and that human interaction and just the energy sharing is still an important part of the puzzle for me.
Bridget, thank you for that. Susannah, as Bridget was speaking, it got me thinking about how there could be instances where it makes things longer. An example I heard the other day was when I used to pick up my car from the valet, I would go like this. And I think I used this on another episode where I would hand the person the card and he'd get my car. Now I'm sitting at my table. I have to scan a QR code. I have to download the app. I have to sign into the app. I have to put my credit card. It's like 13 steps. So this is not actually helpful. It's helpful for that platform to get the data, but certainly not for the customer. So Susannah, do you have any inkling or any thoughts around where a red flag might be, where it's like, this is not going to be helpful? Because we've talked a lot about like AI for the sake of AI. And if there's one thing that I continue to take away from this, it's like, why are we doing this first? Not we need AI, let's put it in and see what happens. So from that perspective, I'm going to assume you might have a thought or two about that.
I think you kind of answered it when you said you had to do X number more tasks, right? When the AI usage, or really when the product change in general requires the user to do more or take on more of that cognitive load, I think that those are the examples that align with what you're talking about. And we might be like in a middle state right now, right? Things are changing. The AI landscape is changing. The product landscape is moving along at a faster clip than I think any of us have seen in our careers. So these might be like middle steps to get to a better end state. But I think some of the result, at least when it's not super thoughtful, is forcing somebody to go from what used to take 3 clicks to now, this system, then this system, and then they get their augmented AI answer out of it. So I think we're definitely at that point right now where the how does this impact the end user needs to be brought more to the forefront to avoid those instances. I do think that they're fewer and farther between. I think there's dramatically more examples of where the augmentation that comes from leveraging AI, it shortens cycles. When Bridget was talking, I was thinking about the implication on like the pharmaceutical companies, right, that can now use the digital twin technology and just shorten that cycle from 10 years to a matter of a few years in terms of drug discovery and all the processes that it has to go through to get from idea to actual solution. So I think that in more cases than not, it's definitely going to shorten those cycles, but it needs to not put more onus on the end user.
I was thinking, Bridget, I don't know, this is an out of left field question, but as you both were speaking, one of the things that came up for me are underserved markets for healthcare. And there's a startup that I was working with recently where they're using a platform to do virtual cardiac and lung rehabilitation, especially for places where they just don't have enough in-house rehab for the folks. So you have 1 in 20 people who have had an event, who've been to the hospital, actually being able to get care. Is there anything going on in the healthcare field that you could talk about that is maybe extending the reach of organizations or hospitals or providers through AI?
Absolutely. A lot of rural areas are being better served now because of things like virtual medicine. So I think one of the best things that came out of COVID, if that's an oxymoron in and of itself, is just virtual medicine, telemedicine, because healthcare was so afraid of taking that leap. And everyone said, no, we won't be able to legally do this. There are too many barriers in place. This will never happen. And literally overnight it happened. So, and now it's here to stay. So folks are able to get this care just like you spoke of, but not even just with some of the specialties, literally with some primary care. If you have someone who their closest facility is an hour and a half or 2-hour drive from home, what's the likelihood of them getting medical care on any kind of regularity? Very slim to none. So, and it's even like virtual education, like diabetic education, things like this that are so meaningful and so impactful to outcomes for care, that now we've been able to tilt the other direction a lot of folks have access to smart devices now. Not everyone, but there are initiatives also going on with healthcare organizations that serve highly underserved populations where they are able to sponsor and provide a smartphone so folks have access to some of these telemedicine type tools and care that they wouldn't ordinarily have. So pairing, in addition to kind of that remote aspect of telemedicine being more accessible, pairing some of the reality that's happening with the wearable devices. So a lot of people now have their smart watch of whatever brand you choose, or ring, or whatever the case may be, that they're able to do some of the tracking. And there's so much AI implanted there that is able to, help them with some insights, help them better understand how to take charge of some of their own care, which is really what it gets down to. That's preventative medicine. No provider is going to be side by side with an individual every day of their life, and medicine is every day of your life. So those are the things that are really, I think, can be very impactful. And we've seen some pretty good improvements, especially in some of the more rural and underserved areas.
I have a question for you both, and this just came up today. So, to preventative medicine, I had someone just say to me today, they weren't in the medical field, but he said, "You know what's better than preventative? Predictive." So, so Susannah, when I say the word predictive, even beyond preventative, what do you think? What's dancing in your mind or around the ether for you when we talk about predictive?
I think that there's a lot of data that could be used better than is currently being used to predict. What I think about is, we know our family histories, right? We fill them out on the forms when we go to the doctor. But what is that doing? It's informing the doctor what questions to ask. But what could it actually be used for? It could be used for, preventative or predictive tests to make sure. We could get so far ahead of what might be coming down the pike if we were to better use that familial or genetic data.
So the analogy, this actually came from a founder who puts sensors on trucks to let organizations know, hey, the wheel is probably going to fail within the next few weeks. So rather than have it happen on the road, you can put that truck. Yeah, pretty cool. But what you're laying out here, Bridget and Susannah, is like, I'm wearing a predictive device, and I'm referring to my Apple Watch Ultra 2. So so this idea of this internet, like this augmentation, back to augmentation, it's like once we start to get this data, and we're all, I'm wearing it on my wrist right now, getting someone in, and timing is everything, right? It's like, hey, this isn't looking good. Maybe in the next 3 weeks, something might not be good, rather than just like, okay, great, you've got 10 minutes and you've got to get in. So Bridget, is there anything that comes to mind for you, probably around beyond prevention, but in predictive medicine or predictive healthcare?
Absolutely. I think there's multiple pieces to it. There's, I like an empowerment model. So there's, using the data to better empower individuals to take charge of their own health. I think that's huge. I think many people don't have a background in healthcare. They probably didn't necessarily enjoy science. Not everyone wanted to be a scientist, right? All those things. So they look at WebMD, or they might just Google things. That's not the best, and it generally will, lead you down a very bad rabbit hole. So empowering people with actual data that is meaningful, and they can see it be impactful in their own life, and have them make small changes that in aggregate are going to lead to better outcomes. I think that is huge, and that's where the potential is. I think where we have to be cautious, though, is to realize that the model of empowerment still puts that power in the user's hands. Not everyone's going to want to do this. Not everyone is going to, even with all that data now readily available, want to or be able to, for other factors, take charge of their health in the way that we might think that they should. So we have to remember that it's not our decision to force people into this model, but it is great for us to be able to provide them with the access to meaningful data that can be impactful to their life.
So we're at about a half hour. I do have just one more question for the both of you. And then, of course, anything that you want to impart that we may not have covered. So for a final word, finish this sentence. Suzanne, I'll go to you first. The future belongs to organizations that...
The future belongs to organizations that can align their strategy with the emerging technologies in a way that genuinely serves their end user or end customer.
Thank you for that. Bridget. The future belongs to organizations that
adapt to the changes happening around them and adopt meaningful tools to maintain that positive forward momentum despite whatever storm might be happening around them.
So that is it for this episode of Ascendle Unscripted. If this sparked new thinking for you, send it to someone else driving transformation in their company or organization. Ascendle Unscripted is available on Spotify, YouTube, and all major platforms. We will see you next time. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Susannah, for joining us.